They thought this marriage would bury his last remaining farm. They chose her because they believed she was a burden, a woman the whole land would ridicule. But while the powerful were celebrating their victory, Maris Hale was quietly observing every inch of land, every cow, every mistake that went unnoticed. They had used her as a weapon, and they would never have imagined that she would destroy everything they had built. Like, comment the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has progressed, and follow so you don't miss what happens next. The morning Gideon Cross rode into Harlan Beach's office to sign the marriage papers, 3 men were already laughing before he pushed open the door. He heard them through the wood, low, mean laughter, the kind that men allow themselves when they're certain no one important is listening. Gideon stood outside for a moment with his hand on the iron handle, and he made himself breathe once before he went in, because he knew that if he walked through that door with his jaw already set the way it wanted to set, he'd say something that would cost him the one thing he couldn't afford to lose right now, which was time. He pushed the door open. Harlan Beach sat behind a desk that was too large for the room, a man who had grown wide and pale from years of letting other people do his physical work for him. To his left stood Percy Dale, who managed Beach's cattle brokerage and had the smile of a man who practiced it. To his right was someone Gideon didn't recognize, younger, city clothes, the kind of boots that had never seen actual mud. "Cross," Beach said, and spread his hands like he was welcoming a guest rather than a man he'd spent 2 years trying to ruin. "Glad you came to your senses." "I came to sign papers," Gideon said. "Let's not make it something it isn't." He was 38 years old and looked it, sun-creased, with the kind of leanness that comes from missing meals on purpose, brown hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that had gone a little flat over the last year from the particular exhaustion of fighting the same losing battle over and over. His ranch, the Crescent K, sat on 460 acres of Montana grassland that Harlan Beach had been trying to acquire since before Gideon's father died. The land was good land. That was the whole problem. It sat between 2 of Beach's largest holdings like a stone in a boot, and Beach had been trying to shake it loose for the better part of a decade. He'd tried buying it. Gideon had refused 3 times. He'd tried drying up the water access. Gideon had dug 2 new wells at ruinous cost. He'd tried running off the hands. Most of them had stayed anyway because Gideon paid what he promised and didn't ask men to do things that shamed them. Now he'd tried something else. "The arrangement is straightforward," Percy Dale said, pulling a folded document from inside his coat. "Miss Hale has agreed. You've agreed since you're here. The debt on the Crescent K is restructured under the new terms, and you get 6 months of operating credit." "I know what I agreed to," Gideon said, "just making sure we're all clear." Gideon took the document and read it the way he read every document, which was slowly and with his finger tracing each line, because he'd learned years ago that men like Beach put the important parts in the middle, where your eyes want to skip. He read it twice. The terms were what they'd discussed, worse than he wanted, better than bankruptcy, which was where the Crescent K was pointing if he didn't do something soon. The debt extension was real, the credit line was real, and the marriage clause was real. He signed it. The younger man in the city boots said something quiet to Beach as Gideon set down the pen, and Beach covered his mouth with one thick hand, but not quite fast enough. Gideon picked up his copy of the papers and folded them and put them inside his coat without looking at either of them. "When do I meet her?" he asked. "She arrives Thursday," Beach said, "on the afternoon stage from Billings." Gideon nodded and walked out, and he didn't let himself think too hard about what he'd just done until he was back on his horse and a mile down the road, at which point he stopped and sat there in the middle of an empty field for a while with his hands loose on the reins and the horse cropping at whatever dry grass it could find. He was not a man who asked for help easily. The Crescent K had been in his family for 22 years, and he had run it alone for the last 6, since his father's stroke and then his father's death 18 months after that. He had a foreman named Dutch Carey, who'd been with the ranch since before Gideon was born, and 4 hands: Rollo, Seb, a quiet young man everyone called Tick, and a broad-shouldered Mexican named Emilio, who was the best roper Gideon had ever seen. He had 400 head of cattle that were thinner than they should be after 2 dry summers, a hay supply that wouldn't carry them through a bad winter, and a debt load that had stopped letting him sleep through the night about 8 months ago. He needed the credit. He'd known that going in. What he hadn't let himself think about too clearly was the woman. Maris Hale arrived on Thursday the way Beach had said, on the afternoon stage, and Gideon was there at the depot with his hat in his hands because his mother had raised him with certain habits that stuck even when he'd rather be rid of them. He recognized her immediately, not because he'd been told what to look for, but because she was the only woman who stepped off the stage unaccompanied, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to navigate spaces that weren't quite designed with her in mind. She was a big woman, broad through the shoulders and full through the hips, with brown hair pinned up under a sensible hat, and a face that was not pretty, not in the way the word usually got used, but alert, watchful. She had dark eyes that moved around the depot yard like she was already taking inventory. She spotted him before he could decide how to arrange his expression. "Mr. Cross," she said. Not a question. "Miss Hale." He put his hat back on. "Welcome to Garrison." She looked at the town the way he'd looked at Beach's document, carefully, without committing to anything. Garrison was not a town that rewarded optimism. It had 2 saloons, a general store, a feed merchant, a barber shop, a small bank that Beach owned outright, and a post office that was also sometimes a dentist's office, depending on the day. The main street was mud for 6 months of the year and dust for the other 6. "I've seen worse," she said. "It has its qualities." "Does it?" He almost smiled. "Some." She had 1 trunk and a leather satchel that she kept close, and she didn't ask for help with either of them, though he took the trunk anyway because it seemed like the right thing to do. They didn't talk much on the ride out to the ranch, which suited him fine. He wasn't a man who filled silence as a courtesy. After about 20 minutes, she started asking questions, though quiet, specific questions about the land they were passing through, about water sources, about which grasses were which, and what they indicated about soil quality. He answered them honestly, because the questions were honest, and by the time they pulled up to the Crescent K, he had revised his early sense of her somewhat. She wasn't what he'd expected. He hadn't been sure what he'd expected. The ranch itself looked worse in the late afternoon light than it did in the morning. The light hit the weathered boards of the barn at an angle that showed every place where paint had given up and wood had followed. The house was solid, but bare. The yard was clean because Gideon kept it that way through habit. But there were places where things needed doing that hadn't been done because there hadn't been time or money. Maris got down from the wagon and stood in the yard and looked at it all. "How many head?" she asked. 412, last count. Lost 11 to the drought this summer." "Breeding lines?" "Mixed. Some Hereford, mostly Shorthorn. My father bought for hardiness over production." She nodded slowly. "How much do you owe?" Gideon looked at her sideways. "That's a direct question." "It's a direct situation." He told her the number. She didn't flinch, which he noted. "And the credit line from Beach's arrangement, you trust it?" "I trust it the way I trust a fence that somebody else built. I'll use it, but I'll check every post." She looked at him for the first time directly, and he had the odd sensation of being assessed in the same thorough way she'd assessed the pasture land. "All right," she said. "I'd like to see the grazing maps if you have them, and the breeding records. It's nearly dark." "Tomorrow, then." He showed her to the room that had been his sister's before his sister married and moved to Colorado, and he went back out to the barn to make sure Emilio had finished with the horses. And he stood there for a while in the smell of hay and animals and thought about what had just happened to his life. The county knew about the marriage before the week was out, the way the county always knew things. Not through any one person, but through the particular osmosis of small communities where information travels faster than horses. The reaction was largely what Gideon had expected, which didn't make it easier to absorb. The men at the feed store went quiet when he walked in on Saturday morning, and then went deliberately loud again in that particular way that meant they'd been talking about him. Old Carl Peter, who ran the store and had known Gideon's father for 30 years, handed him his order without quite meeting his eyes. "Heard you got yourself a wife," Carl said. "Heard right." "From Billings, they say." "That's right." Carl looked like he wanted to say something else and thought better of it. The 2 men near the stove had stopped pretending not to listen. Gideon took his order and left, and he heard the conversation start back up behind him before the door had fully closed. At the saloon that night, he went once a week, had a single drink. It was a ritual he maintained partly for the social intelligence it provided. A man named Frank Aldous pulled a chair next to him without being invited and said, with the false warmth of a man delivering something he'd rehearsed, "Hell of a thing, Cross. Beach really stuck it to you on this one, didn't he?" "I don't know what you mean," Gideon said. "The woman." Frank lowered his voice like he was doing Gideon a favor. "Word is, Beach arranged the whole thing. Pulled her from some... Look, I'm not saying anything against you personally, but you have to know what people are saying. That you're done. That bringing in a woman like that is just... It's the ranch giving up." Gideon looked at his drink. "A woman like what?" he asked. Frank opened his mouth and closed it. "I'm curious," Gideon said. "What kind of woman is she exactly?" "You know what I mean. Say it plain or don't say it." Frank's face went through several changes. She's not what a rancher's wife. She asked me the soil drainage patterns on the North Quarter yesterday morning," Gideon said. "Before breakfast. Knew what the grass color meant. I've been on this land my whole life, and she asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself." He picked up his drink. "So when you figure out exactly what kind of woman that makes her, you let me know." He finished his drink alone. Maris was up before him the first 3 days, which he only discovered because he was an early riser himself, and she was already gone from the house before he'd finished pulling on his boots. He found her the first morning standing in the north pasture in the gray pre-dawn with his breeding ledgers tucked under one arm, walking the fence line. The second morning she was in the barn with Emilio, who spoke limited English, communicating with him through gestures and the shared language of people who actually know animals. The third morning she was on the roof of the smaller outbuilding with a hammer. "What are you doing?" he called up. "3 shingles are loose on the east side," she called back. "They'll go in the first hard rain, and then you'll have water damage to the interior supports." "I know about the shingles. When were you going to fix them?" He didn't have a good answer for that. She came down the ladder with the confidence of someone who had been climbing things her whole life, and she didn't look at him with any particular satisfaction when she reached the ground, just handed him the hammer and went back inside to start the coffee. Dutch Carey found him standing there still holding the hammer and gave him a look. "She fixed the shingles?" Dutch asked. "3 of them." Dutch nodded slowly. Dutch was 61 years old, had been a cowhand since he was 15, and had the economy of expression that comes from a lifetime of doing hard things without talking about them. He watched Maris's retreating back with the particular attention of a man recalibrating. "Huh," he said. "Yeah," Gideon said. "Ted." She showed him the grazing rotation idea on the 4th day, spreading a hand-drawn diagram on the kitchen table after supper while the hands were still cleaning up outside. It wasn't complicated once you saw it laid out. Divide the available pasture into thirds, rotate the herd in a pattern that let each section recover before the cattle came back to it. It would require moving the animals more often and temporarily reduce the pressure on the 2 sections that were showing stress from overgrazing. "This is a lot of extra work for the hands," Gideon said. "It is," she agreed, "for about 2 months. After that, it becomes routine." "Where'd you learn this?" "My uncle ran sheep in eastern Wyoming. Different animal, same principle." Rollo, who was Dutch's nephew and had the bad habit of hanging around doorways during conversations he hadn't been invited to, said from somewhere in the shadows near the back door, "Sheep. She's going to run this cattle ranch like a sheep operation." Maris didn't look up from the diagram. "You're welcome to come look at this map, Mr. Rollo." "Mr. Rollo, you're welcome to come look at the map and tell me specifically what's wrong with the approach." Rollo came to the table with the sullen expression of a man who'd been called on when he didn't have the answer. He looked at the diagram for a long moment. "How do you know the grass will come back fast enough?" he finally said. "We've had 2 dry summers." "We don't know," she said. "But the north section is already showing recovery because the herd's been spending less time there by accident. This formalizes it." Rollo looked at the diagram another moment, then at Gideon, then back at the diagram. He didn't say anything else, which was as close to acknowledgement as Rollo ever got. "Okay." The first attack came in September, not a dramatic one. It never started dramatically. 15 head went missing from the southern fence line over 3 days, a handful at a time, The kind of loss you could almost explain away as strays if you weren't paying attention. Gideon was paying attention, Dutch was paying attention. They rode the fence and found two sections where the wire had been cut cleanly and then bent back to look like it might have snagged. Not strays, Dutch said. No. Rustlers, or somebody who hired rustlers. Or somebody who hired somebody who hired rustlers, Gideon said, because that was how Beach usually worked. Enough layers between himself and the thing that you couldn't point to him directly. He told Maris that evening, expecting to have to explain the implications. He didn't have to. What's the value of 15 head at current market prices? She asked. He told her. And the cost of repairing the fence sections? He told her that too. Then the immediate loss is manageable, she said. What worries me more is the pattern. They're not trying to make a big score. They're bleeding you slowly. What does that tell you? Tells me they're patient, Gideon said. Tells me they've got time and we don't. Which means they know exactly how much pressure the Crescent K can absorb before the accounts break. She was quiet for a moment. Someone's been looking at your books. He hadn't thought of it that way. He sat with that for a minute. Beach had access to the debt records through the bank, he said. That tells him how much you owe. But to know the operating costs, the margins... She stopped. Has anyone from outside had access to your ledgers recently? He thought back through the last year. Percy Dale had come to the ranch twice, both times with legal paperwork that required discussion. He'd waited in the kitchen both times while Gideon went through the documents at the table, and the ledgers sat on the shelf next to the table where they always sat. He said a word that he wouldn't have said if he'd remembered she was in the room. Sorry, he said. I've heard worse, she said. How do we fix the fence situation? Hire a night rider for the southern section. That costs money we don't have for long. It does. What if we move the most vulnerable cattle, the ones nearest the south fence, into the upper pasture? It would compress the grazing in the short term, but it reduces the exposure and it puts the herd further from a road. Upper pasture's not ready yet under the rotation. I know, it's a trade-off. She pulled her chair closer to the table. What would you lose versus what would you risk? They talked it through for 2 hours. He found himself somewhere in the middle of the conversation, surprised by the quality of her thinking. Not because he'd expected her to be stupid exactly, but because he hadn't expected her to think the way he thought, which was in terms of land and animals and practical consequence rather than sentiment. She wasn't romantic about any of it. She didn't pretend the situation was better than it was. She just kept turning the problem around until she could see all its sides. He moved the cattle the next morning. But October arrived cold, with the wind coming down off the mountains in a way that said winter intended to be early and serious. The grazing rotation had been running for 6 weeks by then, and Dutch had stopped pretending not to notice that the north section's grass was coming in stronger than it had in years. He didn't say anything about it directly, but Gideon caught him walking that section one afternoon with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground with the expression of a man who is quietly rearranging what he thought he knew. Emilio had started deferring to Maris on questions about the breeding stock, which he did in his usual wordless way, simply turning to her when she was present and looking at her first before he looked at Gideon. Tick, who was 22 and still in the phase of his life where he hadn't decided what kind of man he was going to be, had started working harder than he needed to when she was around, the way young men do when they want to be seen doing the right thing by someone whose opinion they've decided matters. Seb, who was Dutch's age and had a stubborn streak that ran all the way through him, had not changed his manner toward her at all, which meant he was still working through it in whatever private way Seb worked through things. The women of Garrison had not been friendly. This was not a surprise to Maris. She'd said nothing about it, but Gideon noticed how she was at the general store the first time she went in alone, coming back with what she needed and not what she'd been unable to get because the woman behind the counter had suddenly not had it in stock. He noticed which of the ranchers' wives had not come to call. He noticed, and he didn't bring it up because he didn't know what to say about it that would help. What he did do one evening when they were both sitting at the kitchen table after supper, he with the account books and she with a notebook full of the cramped handwriting she used for her calculations, was ask, without looking up, "Is there anything you need that you haven't been able to get?" She didn't answer right away. "There's a woman in town," she said finally. "Mrs. Tharp. She keeps the dry goods section at the back of the general store. She pretended to be out of oiled canvas last week. I need oiled canvas for the water troughs before the freeze. I'll get it. You don't have to, I'll get it, he said again, not harshly. I go in Tuesday. She looked back at her notebook. Thank you. They sat in silence for a while, which was not uncomfortable silence. They had gotten past uncomfortable silence about 3 weeks in. My father bought this land in 1861, Gideon said. He wasn't sure why he was saying it, except that it felt like the right time. Before I was born, he worked it until the year he died, and he never once said it was easy. He said once that land doesn't belong to anybody. You just borrow it for a while and try not to leave it worse. Maris wrote something in her notebook. My mother said something similar, she said, though she said it about kitchens. He almost laughed. He didn't quite, but almost. The letter from Percy Dale came the second week of October, delivered by a writer from town and written in the careful, pleasant tone of a man communicating threat in the language of business. It noted that the operating credit extended under the arrangement was subject to review at the 6-month mark, and that Beach's consortium would be conducting an assessment of the Crescent K's viability as part of standard due diligence. It wished Gideon well. He read it twice and handed it to Maris without comment. She read it once. They want to see the books, she said. They want to find a reason to call the credit. Before the spring cattle sale. Before the spring cattle sale, he confirmed. She set the letter down on the table. Then we need to be further along than they expect by the time they come, she said. And we need to make sure the books don't show them anything useful. I'm not going to falsify records. I'm not suggesting that. She picked up her notebook and opened it to a page dense with numbers. I'm suggesting we restructure how expenses are categorized so that the improvement work looks like standard maintenance rather than capital investment. It's not falsification. It's just how you tell the story of the numbers. He looked at the notebook. Can you do that without anything dishonest? Yes. She said it in front of him. I kept books for my father's farm from the time I was 14. I know how the columns work. He looked at the numbers she'd already started organizing, and he recognized the intelligence in how they were arranged. The same information, telling a different but equally true story. Maris, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name without the formal address, which he noticed, and she noticed too, though neither of them acknowledged it. Yes? What did Beach tell you when he arranged this? What did he say to get you to agree? A pause. Outside, the wind was picking up. He told me you were a decent man in difficult circumstances, she said, and he told me the terms. He made it sound like you needed someone steady and practical and weren't in a position to be particular. She paused again. He didn't tell me it was designed to fail. When did you figure that out? The second day, she said, when I saw the fence line on the south section. She closed the notebook. The wire was cut before we got here. The rust patterns were wrong for recent damage. Someone cut it a week before I arrived. He sat back in his chair. You knew that, and you stayed. She looked at him with the level look he'd gotten used to. I wasn't going to let them be right about me, she said. November brought the first real snow, and with it, news from Dutch that 2 of their remaining neighbors, the Henley family to the west and old Jacob Marsh to the north, had sold to Beach's consortium within 3 weeks of each other. Dutch delivered this information with his hat in his hands, turning it around the way he did when something troubled him. That puts Beach's land on 3 sides of us now, Dutch said. East, west, north. I know. If he buys the Cutter place to the south. I know, Dutch. Dutch looked at his hat. The hands are asking questions. Rollo's cousin has a situation over near Lewistown that's been looking for a man. Gideon understood what he was being told. What did you tell him? Told him to give it another winter, Dutch said. But I'm not sure that'll hold. Maris, who had been at the other end of the room apparently reading something, said, without looking up, What would it take to keep Rollo? Dutch looked at her, surprised, which meant he'd forgotten she was there. He's not a complicated man, Dutch said carefully. He wants to know the place is going to be there next year. Can we show him something concrete by spring? She asked Gideon. Depends on the winter and the spring prices. What's our current inventory compared to the same point last year? He told her. The numbers were marginally better. Not dramatically, but measurably, which she'd known before she asked. She was building something with the questions, assembling them toward something. Dutch, she said, how long have you been on this ranch? 31 years, he said, slightly wary. Then you know its capacity better than anyone. If we maintain the rotation through spring, what's your honest assessment of the herd quality by June? Dutch was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who only said things he was sure of. Better than I've seen in 5-6 years, he said finally. If the winter's decent. What if it isn't? Worse. What's the worst realistic case? Dutch thought. Lose 20, 25 head to the cold and the weak ones. Come out with maybe 380. And prices at the Garrison auction? Same as last year at best, with Beach's buyers setting the floor. She nodded. She picked up her pencil and wrote something down. What are you figuring? Gideon asked. I'm trying to understand what the spring sale needs to produce, she said, and whether we can produce it through the Garrison auction or whether we need to find somewhere else to sell. Dutch looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at the window, where the snow was coming down steady. There's a market in Miles City, Dutch said slowly. Bigger buyer pool, but the drive is hard. How hard? 8-9 days if the weather holds, more if it doesn't. She wrote that down too. I'm not planning anything yet, she said. I'm just trying to see all the roads. Dutch put his hat back on. At the door he stopped. Mrs. Cross, he said, which was the first time he'd used that. I'll talk to Rollo. She looked up from her notebook. Thank you, Dutch, she said. He went out, and the snow came through the door for a moment before it closed, and Gideon sat across the table from the woman who was supposed to have destroyed his ranch by now, looking at her handwriting filling up the page with numbers that were slowly, carefully, against everything Beach had planned, beginning to point in the right direction. He didn't say anything. He picked up his own account books and went back to work. Outside, the Crescent K settled into winter, the snow covering the improved pasture and the repaired shingles and the relocated herd, covering all the small evidence of a woman who hadn't done what she was supposed to do and wouldn't. Winter on the Crescent. It was not the slow, quiet thing that people who had never lived through a Montana winter imagined it to be. It was constant work, hauling feed, breaking ice on the water troughs before dawn, checking the herd twice daily for the early signs of cold sickness that could take an animal in 48 hours if you missed it. The days were short and the nights were long, and the cold had a particular quality to it, pressing through every gap in the barn boards and under every door, reminding you continuously that it didn't care about your plans. Maris learned the rhythm of it fast, not gracefully. She had her share of mornings where she misjudged the ice on the yard and went down hard, or where she underestimated how much the wind cut across the open ground between the house and the barn. But she didn't complain about it, and she didn't slow down. And by February, even Seb had stopped watching her with that particular expression that meant he was waiting for her to give up and go back to wherever she came from. The breeding records occupied most of her evenings. Gideon had kept reasonable records, but they were the records of a man who knew the information in his head and wrote things down out of obligation rather than analysis, dates and weights and lineage noted without any attempt to find the patterns underneath. Maris found the patterns. She spread 3 years of records across the kitchen table in January and spent 4 evenings cross-referencing them. And what she found was that a specific line of shorthorn bull had been producing calves that consistently gained weight faster in the first 6 months. But that Gideon had been rotating that bull out of the primary breeding rotation in favor of a Hereford cross that had better visual confirmation but worse actual performance numbers. She brought this to Gideon on a Sunday, which was the one morning he allowed himself to sit with coffee before the work started. I want to show you something about the Hennessy bull, she said, setting a page of figures in front of him. He looked at it. He was still on his first cup of coffee, and his expression said so. The Hennessy line, she said, sitting across from him, outperforms the Hereford Cross by about 14% in weight gain at weaning. 14% across the whole calf crop is significant. He looked at the numbers more carefully. My father liked the Hereford Cross, he said. Your father's records are in here too. The Hennessy numbers were better then as well. A pause. You're saying my father was wrong. I'm saying your father may have been choosing for appearance over output, she said, which is a reasonable thing to do when you're building a reputation for the look of your herd. It's less reasonable when you're trying to maximize what you're selling per head. He was quiet for a moment. She'd learned not to push into his silences, which weren't resistant so much as processing. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which she respected even when it tested her patience. The Hennessy bull is older, he said. 7 years. I know. We have time for one more breeding season from him if we move soon. What I'd suggest is concentrating him on the best 40% of the breeding cows this spring and documenting the results carefully enough that we can sell the calves with records that justify a premium price. He looked at the figures again, then he looked at her. Who taught you this? He asked. My uncle's sheep operation, like I said, and 4 years keeping books for a cattle dealer in Billings before I... She stopped. Before you what? She picked up the paper and straightened it unnecessarily. Before the arrangement with Beach. He didn't push it, which she appreciated. What she hadn't said, and didn't say, was that the cattle dealer in Billings had paid her half what he'd paid the man before her for the same work, and that when she'd raised this with him, he'd said, with genuine puzzlement, that she ought to be grateful for the experience. She'd left 6 months later when she found out he'd been billing his clients for accounting hours she'd worked and pocketing the difference. She'd had no way to prove it, and no one who would have listened if she had. Beach's arrangement had looked, at the time, like the best option in a narrow field. She was still deciding whether she'd been right about that. The Hennessy breeding rotation became the plan for spring. Dutch supported it, partly because he was a man who trusted numbers when they were laid out clearly, and partly because he had a stockman's eye and had always privately thought the Hennessy calves looked stronger at weaning. Rollo had no opinion about cattle genetics and was primarily concerned with whether the rotation schedule would create more work, which Maris was honest about. It would, for about 3 weeks in March. 3 weeks, Rollo said. Give or take, she said. After that, the concentration makes some things easier. Rollo looked at Dutch. Dutch shrugged. Fine, Rollo said, which was more than she'd gotten from him on most things. What? The consortium's assessment visit came in February, on a day that had gone bright and brittle after a week of heavy snow, the kind of cold that was almost beautiful if you were indoors looking at it. Percy Dale arrived with 2 men Gideon didn't recognize, both carrying the look of people whose job was to find specific things wrong with specific situations. They spent 4 hours on the property, walking the pasture, examining the herd, looking at the barn and outbuildings with the careful attention of men building a case. Maris stayed in the house. This had been her choice, and she'd explained it to Gideon the night before with the pragmatic clarity he'd come to expect from her. They came here expecting to find a disaster, she said. If I'm visible, they'll look for a way to make me part of the disaster narrative. If I'm not, they have to evaluate what's actually in front of them. That's a cold way to think about it, he said. It's an accurate way to think about it. She had spent the previous week making sure what was in front of them would be difficult to argue with. The books were organized in the restructured format she'd developed, showing operating costs that were entirely truthful and capital improvements that were categorized with complete accuracy, in a way that told the story of a ranch that was managing itself conservatively through a difficult period rather than one on the edge of collapse. The herd's improved condition was visible to anyone who looked at them. The pasture rotation's results were evident in the grass coverage on the recovered sections. Gideon walked the property with Dale and the 2 assessors and answered their questions without elaborating. He'd always been good at that, giving people exactly what they asked for and nothing more, letting them fill in their own assumptions. Dale asked about the missing cattle from September. Some strays, Gideon said, recovered most of them. The fence damage on the south section? Weather, Gideon said, looking at Dale steadily. It's been a hard year for fencing. Dale said nothing. His expression said he knew Gideon was giving him exactly what he asked for and nothing more, and that there was nothing he could do about it. When they were done, Dale stood in the yard and looked at the ranch with an expression that Gideon couldn't quite read. The condition of the herd is better than the last assessment suggested it would be, Dale said. It's been a decent winter, Gideon said. The books look conservative. They are conservative. Dale looked at him a moment longer. The credit terms stand for another quarter, Mr. Cross. We'll reassess in May. He left with his 2 men, and Gideon went inside and found Maris at the kitchen table with her notebook, writing, as if she'd simply been continuing her work while strangers walked her property and looked for reasons to take it. "How'd it go?" she asked, without looking up. "Credit stands through May." She nodded. "We need to have something real to show them by May." "I know. The spring calves, if the breeding rotation works, and if the prices—" "I know, Maris." She looked up at him then, and for a moment her composure had something behind it that she didn't usually let show. Not fear exactly, but the kind of weight that comes from knowing exactly what the numbers mean and exactly how little margin there is for things to go wrong. "I'm not going to let them have this place," she said. It was the first time she'd said anything like that, claimed the ranch as something that belonged to her too, something she had a stake in defending. He'd wondered when that would happen, or if it would. "Neither am I," he said. March came in mean, the way it often did in Montana. A week of deceptive warmth followed by a late blizzard that killed 4 calves before anyone could get them inside and pinned the crew to the barn for 3 days. Gideon lost 2 days of scheduled work on the pasture fencing that he didn't have days to lose, and when the weather finally broke, there was a quality to the mud that made every task take twice as long. Maris had spent the blizzard days doing what she always did with confined time, which was think. She had a project she hadn't mentioned to Gideon yet. She'd been mapping the homesteads within a 30-mile radius that were not connected to Beach's cattle brokerage, cross-referencing their locations with what she knew about their livestock needs. There were 11 families farming or ranching in relative isolation, too small to command good prices at the Garrison auction and too far from Miles City to make the drive worthwhile. She'd been thinking about what a direct supply arrangement might look like, the Crescent K selling breeding stock, hay, and labor directly to those families rather than routing everything through brokers. She brought it to Gideon during the brief window between the blizzard and the mud. "We have something they need," she said, "and they're not connected to Beach." "Some of those families," he said, looking at her map, "haven't had a good relationship with ranchers their size. The Kettles, for instance. Their water dispute with the Marsh operation went on for 3 years. Marsh sold to Beach last fall," she said. "That dispute is over." He looked at the map again. "You want me to ride out to 11 homesteads," he said. "No, I want us to ride out to 4 of them, the ones closest and the ones with the most obvious needs." She pointed. "The Kettle family has no breeding bull. They've been borrowing from a neighbor who also just sold to Beach. The Frayne family has a hay shortage every spring without fail. I've been looking at our production estimates, and we'll have a surplus if the south section recovers the way Dutch thinks it will. The Alderman place. I know Tom Alderman." "Does he trust you?" Gideon considered. "As much as he trusts anybody." "That might be enough." She folded the map. "These aren't charity arrangements. Everyone would be paying fair prices, and we'd be giving them something Beach's operation doesn't offer, which is dealing with people who actually know their names and aren't going to move the price on them without notice." He thought about it for a day. She'd learned to give him that, and the next morning he came to breakfast and said, "I'll start with the Kettle place. I know Henry Kettle from before. The Frayne family is more of a stretch." "I'll go to the Fraynes," she said. He looked at her. "You don't need to—" he started. "Gideon," she kept her voice even, "I've been on this ranch for 4 months. I know the operation, I know the numbers, I know what we can offer and at what price and why it's worth their while. Sending you twice when I can go once is inefficient." A long pause. "Rachel Frayne is not going to be friendly," he said. "I'm used to that." He didn't argue further, which was progress of a kind. Rachel Frayne was not friendly. She opened the door of the Frayne homestead with the expression of a woman who had been disappointed by enough visitors that she'd stopped hiding it. And when Maris introduced herself, the expression shifted into something more guarded and complicated, because the news about the cross marriage had traveled the way all news traveled out here, and Mrs. Frayne had clearly formed an opinion. "Mrs. Cross," she said without warmth. "Mrs. Frayne, I won't take much of your time." She didn't ask Maris in. They conducted the entire conversation on the porch in the March cold, which Maris accepted without comment, keeping her posture easy and her voice matter-of-fact as she laid out the hay supply arrangement. Fair price, spring delivery, no broker fees. She had the numbers written on a folded piece of paper, and she handed it over and let Rachel Frayne read it herself. Maris watched the woman's eyes move across the page and saw the exact moment the numbers made their argument more effectively than any words she could have added. "This is per ton?" Rachel said. "Yes, at current market minus 12%, no brokerage commission." "And you'd deliver?" "To your property line. You'd need to move it from there." Rachel Frayne looked up from the paper. She didn't look friendly, exactly, but the quality of her unfriendliness had changed. "I'd need to talk to my husband," she said. "Of course." She left without the answer, but she left the paper in Rachel Frayne's hand, and 2 days later a note arrived at the Crescent K with a question about payment terms. That note was the beginning of something, though nobody called it that at the time. But by April, 3 of the 4 homestead conversations had produced working arrangements of one kind or another. Tom Alderman had agreed to a breeding bull lease for the spring season. Henry Kettle had taken the hay offer and added a request about labor for a fence project that turned into a 2-way arrangement where the Kettle boys spent a week on the Crescent K's south fence in exchange for the Crescent K crew spending 3 days on the Kettle property. The Fraynes had taken the hay deal, and through Rachel Frayne, who remained prickly in all communications but was apparently honest about results, had mentioned the arrangement to 2 other homestead families that Maris hadn't yet approached. It was not an empire. It was not even a network, really, not yet. It was just a few people who had found it useful to deal with each other rather than with Beach's operation. But it was there, and it was outside of what Beach had planned for. The ranch hands had noticed, not the specific arrangements, but the effect. There was more activity on the property, more contact with neighbors, more sense that the Crescent K was a place that was doing things rather than enduring things. Even Seb, who was constitutionally immune to optimism, had stopped being actively pessimistic, which in Seb translated to a kind of gruff neutrality that was practically cheerful by comparison. Rollo had said to Tick, loudly enough for Maris to hear while she was working 20 feet away, "She's not bad, for someone who came from a sheep operation." Tick had nodded seriously. Maris had kept writing. The May assessment was coming. Percy Dale would ride out with his assessors again and look for the thing that wasn't there. The failing ranch, the burdened wife, the inevitable collapse that Beach had built the whole scheme around. He would look, and what he would find instead was 418 head of cattle in better condition than they'd been in 5 years. A set of books that showed a ranch managing itself carefully through a difficult period, and a series of direct commercial relationships with neighboring homesteads that represented the beginning of something Beach's operation had never offered and couldn't easily replicate. It was not enough. Not yet. The spring cattle sale would tell the real story, and the spring cattle sale was still 6 weeks away, and 6 weeks on the frontier was a long time for things to go wrong. But for the first time since Maris had stepped off the afternoon stage and looked at Garrison the way a person looks at a problem they intend to solve, the numbers were pointing somewhere other than down, and Gideon Cross, who had stopped sleeping through the night 8 months ago, had started sleeping through it again, which was not nothing, and both of them knew it. The spring cattle sale was scheduled for the 3rd week of May, and the week before it, everything started going wrong at once. It began with the buyers. Gideon had been selling through the Garrison auction for 11 years, and in that time he'd built relationships with 3 regular buyers. Men who came up from Wyoming and the Dakotas each spring, looked at what was available, and paid reasonable prices because they knew the stock and trusted the seller. 2 of them sent word the same week that they wouldn't be making the trip this year. The notes were polite and said nothing specific. The 3rd buyer didn't send word at all, which was its own kind of message. Dutch brought Gideon the 2nd note on a Thursday morning with the expression of a man delivering something he'd been hoping not to have to deliver. "That's Connolly and Marsh both," Dutch said. "I can read," Gideon said, which wasn't fair to Dutch, and he knew it. "Sorry, I know." "Beach's people got to them?" "Most likely." He folded the note. "Or made them a better offer to stay away. Doesn't matter which." He told Maris that evening. She already knew about the 1st buyer cancellation and had been recalculating since then. The 2nd one was confirmation of something she'd been thinking about for 3 days without saying. "The Garrison auction won't work," she said. It wasn't a question. "Without our regular buyers, we're at the mercy of whoever shows up. And Beach controls enough of the local buying that he can set the floor wherever he wants. Miles City, she said. 9 days, he said. Maybe 10 with the herd we're running. What's the route? He pulled the old territory map from the shelf, the one his father had used, with hand-drawn additions in 2 different inks, marking water sources and grazing stops. He spread it on the table and they both leaned over it, and he traced the line with his finger. The route to Miles City went northeast across open grassland, then climbed through a long valley before descending to the Yellowstone River corridor that would carry them the last third of the distance. The valley section, Maris said, putting her finger on the map. This is the Barlow Pass? The lower approach, yeah. It's passable with cattle. My father did it once, about 15 years ago. Once in 15 years. The terrain is rough on the animals, and the drive takes longer. Most operations don't think it's worth it against the closer markets. She was quiet for a moment, studying the map. What markets does Miles City connect to? The Northern Pacific runs through. You can move cattle east to Chicago or west to the coast from there. Bigger buyer pool. The prices are generally better. How much better? He told her what he knew, which was based on conversations rather than direct experience. The numbers, even conservatively estimated, represented the difference between a spring sale that got them through the year and a spring sale that fell short enough to give Beach exactly the shortfall he needed to move against the credit terms. When would we need to leave, she asked. No later than Monday to arrive with enough time before the peak buying period. That was 4 days away. She straightened up from the map and looked at him with the direct look he'd learned meant she was about to say something she'd already decided on. Then we need to talk to the crew tonight, she said. Mom. The conversation with the hands happened after supper, in the barn, because that was where serious conversations on the Crescent K happened. Some unspoken tradition that Gideon had inherited from his father, the idea that decisions about the land got made close to the animals rather than at the kitchen table. Dutch stood with his arms crossed and his face giving nothing away. Rollo sat on a hay bale with the particular posture of a man who was preparing to have an opinion. Emilio stood near the horses, which was where he always stood. Tick leaned against the wall and Seb stood in the door because Seb always wanted to be nearest the exit during difficult conversations. Gideon explained the situation plainly. The buyers had pulled out. The Garrison auction would leave them at Beach's mercy on price. The Miles City option was a 9-day drive through rough country, and he wasn't going to ask anyone to take it who wasn't willing. The silence afterward was the particular silence of men calculating. Rollo said, 9 days is 9 days of wages. Yes, Gideon said. And if the prices in Miles City are what you think, they might be, might not be. I'm not going to promise what I can't guarantee. Rollo looked at Dutch. Dutch looked at the middle distance. Seb said, from the doorway, what's the terrain like in the valley section? Rocky through the middle passage. There's a creek crossing that can be tricky if the snowmelt is still running hard. The western approach to the pass has loose shale on the upper trail that we'd need to move the herd through carefully. Wolves, Emilio said, which was the most Gideon had heard him say in a single word in weeks. Possibly, we'd need night watches through the valley. Tick said, I'll go. Everyone looked at him. He was 22 and had never driven cattle more than 3 days. I'll go too, Emilio said. Dutch uncrossed his arms. Well, he said, I'm not staying behind while these two take the herd over the pass. Rollo looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he looked up. My cousin's situation in Lewistown can wait, he said. Seb was quiet. He was the one Gideon had been least sure of. Seb was pragmatic to the point of coldness sometimes. And he had a sister in Garrison he looked after, and 9 days was 9 days. Seb, Gideon said, nobody's obligated. I know nobody's obligated, Seb said. I'm thinking. He was quiet another moment. The shale section on the upper trail. Is it the eastern face or western? Western. Then you move the herd at midday when the sun's off it and the surface is driest, Seb said. I did a drive through similar terrain over toward the Judith Basin 6 years ago. He shifted against the doorframe. I'll go. Maris, who had been standing slightly back from the group, said, Thank you, all of you. She said it without theatrics, the way she said most things, like she meant it rather than performed it. I want to be clear about what we're going to need on the route. She'd spent 2 hours with the map, while Gideon had been doing the evening feed check. There are 3 points where I'm concerned about the herd's exposure: the first creek crossing, the shale section Seb just mentioned, and the last day's push to the railhead when the animals are going to be tired and will want to make time. I'd like to talk through each one before Monday. Rollo said slowly, "You're coming on the drive?" "Yes." A pause. Rollo looked at Dutch again. Dutch, this time, looked back at him with an expression that said he was on his own. "It's rough country," Rollo said. "I heard Gideon's description the same as you did," she said. "Is there something specific about my coming that creates a problem you want to name?" Rollo opened his mouth, thought better of it. "No," he said. "Good," she said. "Then let's talk about the creek crossing." They left Monday before dawn with 411 head. They'd lost 7 over the winter, recovered 3 strays in April, run the Hennessy breeding rotation through March. And the calf crop was looking strong, but the calves were too young for this drive, which meant leaving them under the watch of a neighbor boy Gideon had hired for the duration. The first 2 days were the kind of driving that reminded everyone why they'd chosen this work, or regretted choosing it, depending on the hour. The terrain was open and the herd moved reasonably well. The spring grass was up enough that the animals weren't fighting the drive, and the weather held. Maris rode on the left flank because that was where she'd positioned herself the first morning, and nobody had argued, and she was, Gideon noticed, a better rider than he'd expected. Not showy, but steady, with the kind of seat that comes from practical experience rather than instruction. Dutch noticed too, in his Dutch way, which meant he stopped watching her with the ambient protectiveness he'd been carrying and started treating her like another hand, which was the highest compliment Dutch gave anyone. The trouble started on day 4. They were a half day from the creek crossing when Tick spotted riders on the ridge to the south, 3 men moving parallel to the herd at a distance that was too deliberate to be coincidental. Gideon had seen riders like that before. He told Tick to say nothing and rode back along the line until he reached Maris. 3 men on the south ridge, he said quietly, keeping pace. She didn't look. Since when? Tick spotted them an hour ago. Might have been longer. Outriders, she said. It wasn't a question. That's my read. Are they going to wait for the crossing or move before it? He'd been thinking the same thing. The creek crossing was the obvious pressure point. Herds strung out across water, men occupied with keeping animals moving, attention divided. If someone wanted to cause a stampede or cut out a section of the herd, the crossing was where they'd do it. Before, I think, he said, they'll want to scatter the herd in open country where it's harder to regroup. How long until the crossing? 3-4 hours. She looked at the herd, then at the terrain, then at him. We need to tighten the formation and move faster, get to the crossing before they decide to move. Faster stresses the animals. Scattered stresses them more. He couldn't argue with that. He rode forward to tell Dutch, and they pushed the pace, and the herd responded with the unhappy compliance of animals that knew something was wrong but couldn't do anything about it. The riders on the ridge matched the pace. They reached the crossing at mid-afternoon, the creek running faster than Gideon had hoped from the late snowmelt, brown water moving with enough force that the lead cattle balked at the edge and had to be pressed forward. This was the worst possible time for the herd to be stalled, half in, half out. The crossing taking 40 minutes when it should have taken 25. The riders came off the ridge when the herd was mid-crossing, not 3 men, 5. They came down the southern slope fast with the specific purpose of men who had been paid to do something and intended to do it before they could think better of it, and 2 of them were firing rifles into the air before they'd crossed half the distance to the herd. The cattle at the rear broke. Gideon was at the far bank helping push the lead animals through when he heard the shots and felt the vibration of the herd changing direction behind him. Dutch was shouting. Emilio was already moving, cutting hard to the right to get ahead of the animals swinging away from the water. Tick was somewhere in the middle of the crossing with cattle pressing around him. Maris was at the rear. He couldn't see her for a moment. Just the dust and the motion of animals and the riders coming in from the south. And that moment was longer than it should have been before he picked her out. On horseback, moving not away from the oncoming riders, but toward the right edge of the breaking herd. She wasn't trying to stop the stampede. She was trying to bend it. pushed the animals that were running into a curve rather than a straight scatter, using the natural tendency of panicked cattle to follow each other to turn the break into a circle instead of a dispersal. Rollo understood what she was doing and moved to mirror her on the left. It didn't work perfectly. 60, 70 head broke through and ran southeast before Emilio and Seb could get around them, but the main body curved and slowed and eventually stopped running in a ragged mass on the near bank, winded and unhappy, but together. The riders didn't press the attack. They pulled up at a distance, made a show of sitting their horses for a moment, and then turned and rode back the way they'd come. They'd done what they were sent to do, cause enough loss and delay to hurt the drive's numbers and timeline. Whether it was enough would depend on how many of the scattered cattle they could recover. The recovery took the rest of the day and most of the night. Emilio brought in 30 animals by full dark. Seb found another 19 the next morning in a draw a mile southeast. The final count when they pushed on was 388, which was 23 fewer than they'd started the crossing with. 23 head was real money. Not ruinous, but real. Maris sat with the numbers that evening over the fire, while the others were doing post-drive tasks, and Gideon sat nearby because he'd learned that sitting near her while she worked was sometimes more useful than asking questions. "We're still viable," she said, without looking up. "But the margin is thinner." "I know. We need the Miles City prices to be what we think they are, not the conservative estimate." "I know that too." She looked up from the notebook. There was something in her face that wasn't quite worry, but was adjacent to it. The look of a person carrying a weight they'd chosen and were not going to put down. "Those men came from somewhere specific," she said. "Someone told them our route and our timeline." "Yeah. Did you tell anyone our departure date?" He thought. He'd mentioned it at the feed store when he bought supplies for the drive, just in passing, to Carl Peter's assistant, who had no reason to carry the information anywhere. But information in small towns traveled along its own routes. "Could have come from anywhere," he said, "or someone's been watching the ranch." They looked at each other across the fire. "Either way," Gideon said, "we keep moving." The shale section on day 7 was as bad as Seb had predicted, and not worse, which was the best you could ask for. They moved the herd through at midday with the surface dry and the animals unhappy but manageable, losing an hour and a half to the pace required and coming out the other side with nothing worse than 2 cattle with minor leg scrapes and Rollo's horse throwing a shoe that Emilio replaced with a spare in 20 minutes. By day 8, the terrain had opened back into grassland, and the animals felt it, the tension going out of the herd in the visible way it does when cattle return to familiar ground conditions. They made good time. The Yellowstone corridor appeared in the distance on the morning of day 9, a dark line of cottonwood against the flat sky, and Miles City beyond it. They arrived on a Wednesday, which was 2 days before the peak of the spring buying period. The railhead at Miles City was 3 times the size of Garrison's auction yard, with pens running in long parallel rows and buyers moving between them in the purposeful way of men with real money and limited time. Gideon had been there once, years ago, as a younger man with his father. He'd forgotten how much larger it felt than what he knew. They penned the herd and spent the rest of Wednesday letting the animals settle and recover from the drive. Maris walked the buyer circuit that afternoon, not to sell, just to listen, moving through the clusters of men with the unremarkable presence of someone doing ordinary business, gathering information about what was moving and at what price. She came back with 3 pages of notes. "There are 2 buyers out of Chicago and 1 consortium from the Dakota territories who've been buying in volume all week," she said. "The Chicago buyers are prioritizing weight and condition over breed. The Dakota consortium is buying for a specific rail contract, and they need volume by Friday." "Our condition is good," Gideon said. "Weight is decent given the drive." "Better than decent. The rotation paid off." She looked at her notes. "I want to approach the Dakota consortium first thing tomorrow, before the other sellers who arrived today. You want to approach them?" "I know their numbers better than you do right now," she said simply, "unless you'd rather go in with less information." He didn't sleep well that night, which wasn't unusual. He lay awake doing the arithmetic he'd been doing for 9 days, running the numbers forward and backward, calculating what they needed against what was possible. He could hear from the next room that Maris was awake too. the small sounds of someone lying still and thinking rather than sleeping. He almost said something through the wall. He didn't because he didn't know what to say that would be more useful than letting them both work through it in their own way. In the morning, she was up first. He wasn't surprised. The Dakota Consortium's representative was a man named Aldrich Voss, and he had the practiced disinterest of someone who had been buying cattle long enough to know that the best negotiating posture was mild boredom. He was at the pens early, as Maris had predicted, walking the rows with a younger man who carried a ledger and wrote things down when Voss pointed at something. Maris approached him at 7 in the morning with Gideon beside her and her notebook in her hand. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I'm Maris Cross. We brought 388 head in from the Crescent K in Garrison County yesterday. I'd like to talk to you before the floor opens." Voss looked at her with the mild boredom already in place. Then he looked at Gideon, then back at her, because she was clearly the one who had spoken. "Garrison County," he said. "That's a long drive." 9 days, the herds rested, and the condition held well. Better than I expected, honestly. Voss's eyes moved to the notebook in her hand. "You have figures?" "I have everything." She opened the notebook to the page she'd prepared the evening before. Weights estimated from visual assessment, condition grades, the breeding documentation from the Hennessy rotation, the winter survival rate compared against county averages. She handed it to him. He looked at it with the same mild expression, but his eyes moved more carefully than the expression suggested. "Your survival rate through winter is better than most of what came in this week," he said. "We changed the grazing rotation last fall. The animals came through in better condition than the previous 2 years. The breeding records are detailed." "Yes. We documented the spring rotation specifically so buyers would have something concrete to work from." Voss handed the notebook back. He looked at the pens where the Crescent K herd was still settling from yesterday. "I'll look at them at 8, he said. "Come back at 9 and we'll talk price." He walked away. His ledger man followed without looking at them. Gideon said quietly, "That went better than I expected." "He's interested," Maris said. "He's not going to show it until he's seen the animals himself. But the documentation surprised him. Most sellers don't come in with that level of record. Because most sellers don't have someone who thought to prepare it." She closed her notebook. "Let's go look at what else is selling this morning. I want to know what the Chicago buyers pay before 9 o'clock. They were back at Voss's position at 9 sharp. He'd walked the Crescent K pens. They'd seen him from a distance, moving through the animals with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd assessed 1,000 herds. He'd spent more time with their cattle than with the 2 adjacent lots, which they'd also watched. The conversation took 40 minutes, which was longer than Gideon had ever spent negotiating a sale. Voss opened low, as buyers always did, at a number that was better than the Garrison floor price, but not as good as what Maris had told Gideon they needed. She countered without flinching, citing the winter survival rate, the breeding documentation, the condition grades relative to the other lots she'd watched him assess that morning. Voss pushed back. She held. There was a point in the middle of it where Gideon almost spoke. He felt the old reflex of a man who has been selling cattle the same way for a decade, the pull toward taking the reasonable offer rather than holding for the right one. He kept his mouth shut because Maris's voice was steady, and she was watching Voss the way she watched everything, which was with complete attention. Voss settled at a number that was above what they needed and below what they'd asked for, which was how every honest negotiation ended. "The documentation is the difference," Voss said as he signed. "I'm paying for certainty. I know exactly what I'm getting, and I can tell my buyers the same." He looked at Maris. "Where'd you learn to keep records like that?" "Practice," she said. Voss looked at her with something that wasn't quite respect, but was moving in that direction. "Next spring," he said, "if you bring the same quality of records, I'll give you first right of negotiation before the floor opens." He left, and Gideon stood there with the signed contract in his hand, and the number on it, which was real and would hold, was more than the Crescent K had cleared from a spring sale in 4 years. He didn't say anything dramatic. There wasn't really anything dramatic to say. He folded the contract and put it in his coat pocket and looked at Maris. "Coffee," she said. "I need actual coffee." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They were back in Garrison by the end of the following week. and the news had traveled ahead of them the way news did, not accurately, but in the general direction of the truth, which was that the Crescent K had gone around Beach's buyers and come back with a number that didn't fit anyone's expectations. Percy Dale rode out to the ranch 3 days after their return, alone this time, without the assessors. He sat in the yard on his horse and asked if Gideon had a moment, and Gideon came out to the fence because he wasn't going to invite Dale inside. "I heard you made the Miles City drive," Dale said. "That's right. In this market." The market worked out. Dale turned his hat in his hands. A habit, Gideon had noticed, that appeared when he was uncertain about something. "Mr. Beach would like to make another offer on the property. In light of recent developments, he's prepared to yield." "No," Gideon said. "You haven't heard the number." "Doesn't matter." Dale looked at him carefully. "Mr. Cross, Mr. Beach is a patient man." "I know he is," Gideon said. "Tell him I am too." Dale left, and Gideon went back inside, and Maris was at the kitchen table with the account books, which was where she always was, and she looked up when he came in. "Dale," he said, "I saw him from the window." She looked at him. "New offer?" "Didn't hear the number." She looked at him for a moment, then back at her books. She didn't say anything about it, which was one of the things about her that had stopped surprising him and started feeling like something he'd miss if it were gone. What happened next didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It accumulated the way most real things accumulate, in small decisions and daily work and conversations that only revealed their significance later. The Miles City sale had cleared the debt load enough that Gideon could breathe. Not comfortable. The ranch was still lean, and the credit from Beach's arrangement was still technically active, but the particular suffocating pressure of debt that was growing faster than income had been broken. They had room to make choices rather than just reactions. The first choice was the Henley property. The Henley family had sold to Beach's consortium in November, but the sale had included a clause about the family retaining residency through the following spring. And when spring came, the Henleys found that Beach's representative was not inclined to make the terms comfortable. Calvin Henley was 54 years old and had worked that land for 20 years. And when he came to Gideon in June with his hat in his hands, Gideon understood before Calvin finished his first sentence what was happening. "I don't have much left after the sale," Calvin said, "but I've got experience and I've got 2 sons who work hard. I'm not asking for charity." "What are you asking for?" Gideon said. "Work. And maybe, if there's a way, some arrangement on a piece of land, something we could build toward." Gideon told him to come back in 2 days. He talked to Maris that evening. "I know the Henley property," she said. She'd walked the fence line between the Crescent K and the Henley parcel in February, cataloging what she could see from their side of the boundary. "The east section has the best water access of anything adjacent to us. If we could control that water, we can't buy the Henley land. Beach owns it." "We can't buy it from Beach," she said, "but there are abandoned parcels further east that nobody's claimed under the territory statutes. 2 of them have been sitting empty for 6 years. She pulled out the map she'd been annotating since winter. "If we file on those parcels and develop them and bring the Henley family on as working partners rather than employees—" "Partners," he said. "Partners who earn equity through labor and time. Like a share arrangement." She smoothed the map on the table. "Calvin Henley knows that eastern terrain better than anyone. His sons are experienced hands. What we'd be offering them is a stake in something rather than wages for someone else's land." He thought about it the way he thought about everything, which was slowly and carefully. "That's not how things are usually done," he said. "I know," she said. "That's not an argument against it." It took 2 more conversations and a meeting with a land attorney in Miles City to structure it properly, but by August the arrangement with the Henley family was in place. 2 parcels east of the Crescent K, filed under the partnership's name, with Calvin and his sons working the land under terms that would give them a percentage ownership stake after 4 years of operation. It was not a simple arrangement, and it was not without risk, and Calvin Henley cried briefly in the land attorney's office when the papers were signed, which he covered by blowing his nose vigorously and looking at the ceiling. Gideon pretended not to notice. Maris handed Calvin a clean handkerchief. The Frayne family came next, not with empty hands, but with a proposal of their own. Rachel Frayne, who remained prickly in all communications but had apparently been thinking since their hay arrangement, showed up at the Crescent K on a Tuesday morning with a document she'd written herself and a request to discuss expanding the supply arrangement into something more formal. Her husband James came with her and said almost nothing, which Gideon recognized as a man who had long ago figured out that his wife's judgment was better than his in certain categories. The arrangement they worked out put the Frayne family into the cooperative supply network as both buyers and sellers. They would continue buying hay from the Crescent K, but would contribute labor during peak seasons in exchange for access to the Hennessy bull line for their own breeding program. "You're building something," Rachel Frayne said at the end of the conversation, with the tone of a woman who was acknowledging a fact rather than paying a compliment. "We're trying to," Maris said. Rachel looked at her with the complicated expression she'd been carrying since February. "I wasn't kind to you when you came to the house," Rachel said. "Last spring." "You were cautious," Maris said. "Given what you'd heard about me, that was reasonable." "What I'd heard was not charitable." "No," Maris agreed. "It wasn't." Rachel was quiet a moment. "What I've seen since is different." She didn't apologize directly, because Rachel Frayne was not built for direct apologies, but the statement was as close as she came, and Maris understood it for what it was and accepted it without extracting anything from it. By fall, 4 families were operating in some form of cooperative arrangement with the Crescent K. The network was not formalized. There was no name for it, no single document that described its structure, just a series of individual arrangements that had grown from practical need and had started to reinforce each other. The Henley sons had put in fencing that also benefited the Crescent K's east pasture. The Kettle family had shared information about a water source on their property that turned out to connect to the aquifer the Crescent K had been relying on, which meant the drought risk for both operations was lower than anyone had understood. Tom Alderman had introduced Gideon to a buyer in Billings he'd been working with for 15 years, a buyer who was not connected to Beach's network. The Billings buyer, a methodical man named Garrison Pierce, who had no relation to the town, came to the ranch in October and spent a day looking at the operation. He'd heard about the Miles City drive through Aldrich Voss, and what he'd heard had brought him here. "Voss doesn't tell people about sellers he wants to keep for himself," Pierce said, walking the north pasture with Gideon. "So the fact that he mentioned you to Tom Alderman means he's trying to make sure you stay in the market and build your herd. He wants to buy from you again." "We hope to sell to him again," Gideon said. Pierce stopped walking and looked at the grass, which was showing the result of 2 full seasons of rotation. "Who designed this grazing system?" he asked. "My wife." Pierce looked at him. "She from a ranching family?" "Sheep operation originally. She came here with fresh eyes." Pierce crouched down and looked at the root structure of the grass near his boot, which was the kind of thing only people who really understood land did. "I'd like to set up a standing contract," he said. "Forward purchase for next spring's drive. I'll guarantee a floor price now in exchange for first right on volume up to 300 head. Gideon kept his voice even. "What floor?" Pierce named a number. It was better than the Garrison auction price and within range of what they'd gotten from Voss. "I'd need to discuss it," Gideon said. "Take your time," Pierce said. "I'm here until tomorrow." Gideon discussed it with Maris that evening for 2 hours, not because either of them was uncertain about taking the contract, but because they both wanted to be sure they understood exactly what they were committing to and what the range of outcomes looked like. This was how they'd started making decisions, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the particular care of 2 people who had learned what happened when things went wrong and had no interest in finding new ways to repeat it. They signed the contract with Pierce the next morning. Harlan Beach heard about the Pierce contract through the same mechanisms he heard about everything, and his response was to send Percy Dale to the ranch for the 3rd time in 8 months. This time Dale came with a formal legal notice claiming that a clause in the original credit arrangement restricted the Crescent K from entering long-term supply contracts with buyers outside the regional brokerage network. Gideon read the notice twice at the kitchen table. "That clause isn't in our agreement," he said. "I know it isn't," Maris said. She had the original signed document in front of her, which she had retrieved from the locked box in the bedroom where she kept all their contracts. "It was never in our agreement. They're claiming it's implied by the language in Section 4. She showed him Section 4. It concerned repayment terms. "That's not what Section 4 says," he said. No, it isn't. She folded the notice carefully. They're hoping we don't have the resources to dispute it legally and will withdraw from the Pierce contract rather than fight. Can we dispute it legally? I wrote to an attorney in Miles City last week, she said, the same one who handled the Henley partnership. I sent him a copy of our original agreement and asked for his assessment. He looked at her. Last week, he said. I saw Dale coming out of the bank 2 weeks ago when I was in town, she said. The timing felt wrong. She had known before the notice arrived. She had looked at Percy Dale's posture leaving a bank meeting and understood that something was coming and had moved to be ready for it. He sat with that for a moment. What did the attorney say, Shub? He asked. He said Section 4 contains no such restriction, that the language Beach's notice is citing doesn't appear anywhere in our agreement, and that filing a legal challenge to the Pierce contract on these grounds would be unlikely to succeed and would expose Beach's consortium to a counterclaim for interference with business arrangements. So they have nothing. They have nothing legally. What they have is the ability to make our lives difficult in other ways while we spend time and money defending a claim that shouldn't exist. She set the folded notice on the table between them. But I think they're running out of other ways. He thought about that. What makes you think so? Because this is sloppy, she said. Citing a clause that isn't there is the kind of move you make when the moves you actually had didn't work. Beach is not a stupid man. Stupid men don't build what he built. But he planned this around a version of us that no longer exists, and he hasn't adjusted. She paused. People who are used to winning don't always recognize when they've started losing. Gideon looked at the notice on the table. I'll write to the attorney, he said. I already sent the response draft, she said. I wanted you to read it before it goes out. She slid 2 pages across the table. He read them. They were precise and factual and left no room for misinterpretation, the way all her written work was, the way she thought. Change the second paragraph, he said, where it says, contrary to the terms of our agreement. Make it contrary to the express terms with express added. It's more specific. She looked at the page. Yes, she said. That's better. She made the change and the letter went out the following morning, and 3 weeks later Beach's consortium withdrew the notice without comment, which was not a surrender exactly, but was close enough to one that Dutch heard about it in town, and came back to the ranch with a satisfaction on his face that he didn't even try to hide. The network of cooperative families continued to grow through the fall, gaining the Alderman operation formally in September and 2 new homestead families in October that Rachel Frayne had sent their way. The Crescent K was no longer one ranch defending itself against pressure from all sides. It was the center of something. Not large yet, not significant enough to make anyone outside of Garrison County take notice, but real, and growing in the particular way that real things grow, which is without announcing itself. Gideon stood at the north fence one evening in November, the 2nd November since Maris had come, watching the herd on the recovered pasture in the fading light. The grass was visibly better than it had been 2 years ago. The animals were heavier. The numbers in the account books, which he no longer dreaded looking at, were pointing steadily in one direction. He heard Maris come up beside him, which he could tell by the sound of her specific walk on the frozen ground. She stood next to him and looked at the herd. Dutch told me the Kettle boys are asking about whether there's room for a 3rd family in the East Parcel arrangement, she said. There might be, he said, by spring. I'll look at the numbers. He kept looking at the herd. Maris, he said. Yes? He'd been thinking about how to say something for a few weeks, and he still hadn't found a clean way to do it, so he said it the way he said most things, which was plainly. When you came here, did you think any of this would happen? She was quiet for a moment. I thought I could make the ranch viable, she said. I didn't know about the rest of it. The network. The people. She paused. The Henleys, the Fraynes, even Rollo. A beat. You. The wind moved across the pasture. The cattle shifted in the way cattle shift at dusk. I'm glad you stayed, he said. It was not the most articulate thing he'd ever said, but he meant it precisely, without qualification, and she understood that. I wasn't going to let them be right about me, she said, which was what she'd said that first winter, word for word. I know, he said. That's not what I meant. Another pause, longer this time. I know what you meant, she said. They stood at the fence a while longer, not saying anything else, the light going out of the sky above the Crescent K and its recovered pastures and its growing network of neighbors who had discovered that survival was more possible together than apart, which was not a dramatic revelation, but was the kind of truth that had been worth every hard mile of arriving at. The third year was when Harlan Beach made his last real move, and it was the kind of move that told you everything about a man. Not the ones he made from strength, but the ones he made when he could feel the ground shifting under him and knew it. It came through the bank. The Garrison Territorial Bank had been under Beach's effective control for 11 years, and the man who ran it, a thin, careful person named Horace Feld, had spent those 11 years doing what men in his position did when they worked for someone like Beach, which was executing instructions and not asking questions about where those instructions came from. In February of the third year, Feld sent a formal notice to every member of the Crescent K Cooperative Network, the Henleys, the Frains, the Kettles, the Aldermans, and 4 newer families who had joined in the previous 18 months, informing them that their small operating accounts, which most of them held at the Garrison Territorial, were being reclassified under new risk assessment criteria and would require full collateral disclosure within 30 days or face suspension. It was not illegal. It was the kind of thing that was technically within the bank's rights and practically designed to cause maximum disruption at the worst possible time, which was early spring when families were spending against anticipated seasonal income, and 30 days of suspended accounts could break a planting season or a breeding cycle. Maris found out on a Tuesday when Rachel Frayne rode to the ranch in weather that had turned mean, her horse lathered, and her expression the particular kind of controlled fury that Rachel Frayne wore when she was frightened and didn't want to show it. "They're doing it to everyone in the network," Rachel said at the kitchen table, her coat still on and dripping. "Calvin Henley got his notice yesterday. The Kettles this morning. James thinks it's because we signed on with the cooperative terms last fall, and Beach found out." "Beach has known about the cooperative for a year," Maris said. She was already at the shelf where she kept the correspondence files. "Then why now?" "Because now it's big enough to threaten something." She pulled the file on the Garrison Territorial's original lending terms with the Crescent K. "He's not trying to stop us. He's trying to make everyone around us unstable enough to pull back from the arrangement." Rachel watched her work. "Will it succeed?" Maris looked up from the file. "Not if we move faster than he expects." She looked at Gideon, who had been standing in the doorway since Rachel arrived. "We need everyone together, tonight if possible." The meeting happened that evening in the Crescent K barn, the same barn where Gideon had talked to his crew about the Miles City drive 2 years earlier, which felt like a different life now. But the barn was the only space large enough, and 14 people stood or sat on hay bales in the lantern light, while Maris stood at the center with the land attorney's most recent correspondence and a map she'd updated the previous week. Calvin Henley spoke first, which was a measure of how far things had changed. A year ago, Calvin had been standing in this same yard with his hat in his hands, asking for work. "I'm not pulling out," he said. "I want that said first. Whatever they do with the bank notice, I'm not pulling out." There was a murmur from the others that was, in its way, an answer. Rachel Frayne crossed her arms and said nothing, which from Rachel meant the same as Calvin's statement. Tom Alderman said, "What are our actual options?" Maris laid it out without softening it, because these were people who had made hard decisions before and deserved accurate information. The Garrison Territorial could suspend accounts under the clause they'd cited. The suspension could last up to 90 days under territorial banking statutes. Challenging it legally was possible, but would take time they didn't have. However, she said, "There is a bank in Miles City, the Northern Territorial Trust, that has been expanding its rural lending portfolio for 2 years. I wrote to them in January, not because I expected this specifically, but because I thought we should know our options before we needed them." She paused. "They are interested in the cooperative as a lending client. The size of the combined operation, the documented performance history, and the forward contracts with Pierce and Voss make us a stronger loan candidate than any of our operations would be individually." The room was quiet for a moment. James Frayne said, "You're saying we move the accounts." "I'm saying we have the option to move the accounts, collectively, which makes the move more significant than any of us moving individually." And I'm saying that if we do it together before the 30-day window closes, the Garrison Territorial loses enough depositor business that the action becomes publicly visible in a way that a quiet individual dispute wouldn't be. Beach will know it was coordinated, Calvin said. He'll have known the moment he saw all the notices go out at once, she said. There's no hiding what this is. The question is whether we respond to pressure by contracting or by demonstrating that the pressure doesn't work. Tom Alderman looked at Gideon. You trust this Miles City bank? I trust Garrison Pierce's read on them, Gideon said. He's been banking there for 8 years, and he's the one who told Maris they were expanding. He looked around the room. I'm not going to tell any of you what to do. You each have your own situation, but the Crescent K is moving its accounts. The vote, such as it was, happened in the way frontier votes happened. Not formally, but through the accumulation of individual decisions spoken out loud, one after another, until it was clear what the room had decided. Every family moved, all 14. The transfer of accounts from the Garrison Territorial to the Northern Territorial Trust took place over the following 2 weeks, coordinated through the Miles City Attorney's Office, and it removed a substantial percentage of the Garrison Territorial's small depositor base in a single visible event. Horace Feld sent a follow-up letter attempting to negotiate. Maris wrote a response that acknowledged receipt of the letter and stated that the transfers were complete, which was all it needed to say. She heard later, through the particular channels by which things were heard in Garrison County, that Feld had taken the letter to Beach personally, and that the conversation that followed had not been a comfortable one. She did not hear this with satisfaction exactly. She heard it and set it aside because there was too much work to spend time on the feelings of men who had lost. What broke Harlan Beach was not one thing. That was what people got wrong later, when the story of the Crescent K Cooperative had traveled far enough that people who weren't there were telling it as though it had a clean narrative shape. The villain falling in a single dramatic moment, the heroes triumphant at the climax. What actually happened was more like what happens when you pull stones from a wall, one at a time, over a long period. Beach's operation didn't fall, it eroded. The bank's credibility in Garrison County suffered after the mass transfer, and 2 years later the Northern Territorial Trust opened a small office in Garrison itself, which drew more depositors and created competition that Beach couldn't control. The cattle brokerage lost ground as the cooperative's direct buyer relationships, with Pierce, with Voss, and eventually with 2 others who'd heard about the operation's documentation practices, meant more of the county's cattle were moving outside the brokerage entirely. Percy Dale left Beach's employ in the 2nd year and took a position in Billings, which was a signal of something even if nobody said explicitly what. The abandoned parcels that Beach had been quietly accumulating for years, the ones he'd held idle, waiting for the right moment to consolidate, started costing him carrying expenses without producing income, because the families he'd expected to be desperate enough to sell labor cheap had found other arrangements. Without the leverage of desperation, the consolidation strategy didn't work. None of this was revenge. This was important, and it was something Maris had been clear about from early on in her specific practical way. Revenge would have meant spending energy and attention on Beach's situation rather than on the cooperative's growth. And the cooperative's growth was the actual work. Beach's erosion was a consequence of that work, not its purpose. But the consequence was real, and it was total. In the 4th year, Harlan Beach sold 2 of his 3 primary holdings to an outside investor from St. Paul and relocated to Helena, where he had family connections and where his name meant less. He did not announce the move. He simply went, the way men go when they have run out of moves in a place and need to be somewhere that doesn't know their history yet. Percy Dale's replacement lasted 8 months, and then the brokerage restructured under new ownership. The bank eventually stabilized under Feld's management, diminished, and quieter. No longer the instrument it had been. Gideon heard about Beach's departure from Dutch, who had heard it in town. Gone, Dutch said, with the same economy he used for everything. Gone, Gideon confirmed. They were mending fence on the east section, the extended parcel that the Henley partnership had developed over the previous 2 years. The work was the same work it had always been: wire and posts and the particular physical satisfaction of repairing something that had been broken. You feel anything about it? Dutch asked, which was an unusually personal question for Dutch. Gideon thought. Relief, he said. Mostly relief. Dutch nodded. That's the right feeling. Yet, the cooperative formally incorporated in the fifth year under the name the Cross Valley Agricultural Partnership, which was Maris's suggestion and which she had arrived at not for any sentimental reason, but because it was accurate and would be recognized in legal documents. 11 families were partners by that point, with a combined herd that was among the largest in the territory, forward contracts with 4 regular buyers, a shared breeding program that had extended the Hennessy documentation practices across all member operations, and a reputation for record quality that Aldrich Voss had mentioned to 3 other buyers in the previous calendar year. The partnership had a management structure because it needed one. This was Maris's most difficult work, and she did not find it natural. Running her own household's numbers was one thing. Developing systems that 11 families with different temperaments and different risk tolerances could operate within together was something else. And there were arguments, real ones, not the polite disagreements of people performing cooperation. The Kettle family and the Alderman family had a boundary dispute in the 3rd year that went unresolved for 4 months and required a formal mediation. 2 of the newer partner families had different views on debt tolerance that created friction in joint purchasing decisions. Rachel Frayne thought one of the newer partners, a young man named Cass Devereaux, was cutting corners on his breeding documentation and said so directly and loudly at a partnership meeting in a way that did not improve anyone's afternoon. Maris let most of it run its course and intervened only when it was going somewhere that couldn't be undone. She had learned through the slow accumulation of experience that her instinct was to solve problems before other people had finished having them, and that this instinct was sometimes wrong. That some disputes needed to go through their full arc before the people in them were ready for resolution, and that imposing a solution early just drove the conflict underground. This was one of the things nobody could have told her in advance. She had to learn it by doing it wrong first. The argument between Kettle and Alderman resolved itself eventually through the boundary mediation, and afterward the 2 families had a working relationship that was more honest than the one they'd had before the dispute, which was the way conflict sometimes worked when people didn't run from it. Cass Devereaux improved his documentation after Rachel Frayne's public critique, which stung him enough that he overcorrected and produced some of the most detailed breeding records in the partnership, which Rachel acknowledged with a single dry comment at a later meeting that was, coming from Rachel, equivalent to a standing ovation. In the 6th year, a reporter from a Helena newspaper came to Garrison to write about the partnership. He was a young man with a notebook and the particular enthusiasm of someone who had found a story that fit neatly into the shape stories were supposed to have, and he interviewed Gideon for 2 hours and then asked if he could speak with Maris. The interview with Maris went differently than he expected. He asked her how it felt to have proven everyone wrong. She looked at him for a moment. "That's not what happened," she said. He looked up from his notebook. "I didn't come here to prove people wrong," she said. "I came here because it was the option in front of me, and I thought I could make something of it. The people who doubted me, most of them were working from what they could see, and what they could see was limited. That's not stupidity, it's just limited information." She paused. "I'd rather they had updated their information than feel bad about what they thought before." He wrote that down. "What about the people who actively worked against you?" he asked. "Beach and his associates, don't you think they deserve to be called what they were? They were men who wanted something they couldn't take fairly, so they tried to take it unfairly," she said. "They failed. That's the complete story. There's nothing more you want to say about them?" "No," she said. "There isn't." He wrote that down too, and the piece he published in Helena used her words more than Gideon's, which Gideon read without any feeling except something close to pride. That was not exactly pride, more like the recognition that you had been right about something important, and that the thing you'd been right about was bigger than you'd known when you were in the middle of deciding. Dutch retired in the 7th year, which he announced to Gideon on a March morning with the same matter-of-fact delivery he used for everything. "I'm done after the spring drive," he said. "All right," Gideon said. "Emilio can run the crew. He's been running it for 2 years anyway." This was true. Emilio had grown into the foreman role so gradually that nobody had made an announcement about it. One day he was a hand, and then by accumulation of daily decisions, he was the person the other hands looked to, And at some point, Gideon had stopped thinking of Dutch as the foreman and started thinking of him as something else, which was the connective tissue between the Crescent K as it had been and the Crescent K as it was. "You're not going far," Gideon said. "No," Dutch said. "I'll be in town." He paused. "I might come out and look at the cattle now and then, if that's all right." "You know it is." Dutch looked at the north pasture, which was green in the early spring light, visibly and demonstrably better than it had been the first winter Maris arrived. "Your father would have liked her," Dutch said. It was the most Dutch had ever said about anything personal in the 7 years since Maris had come. Gideon looked at the pasture. "Yeah," he said. "He would have." Dutch left in June with a handshake from Gideon, and to everyone's surprise, a brief embrace from Maris, which Dutch received with the stiff dignity of a man who had not been hugged often enough in his life to be comfortable with it, but who was not going to pull away. The thing about building something real is that it doesn't announce itself. There's no single morning where you wake up and understand that you've crossed from one state of existence to another. The Crescent K's transformation from a struggling ranch on the edge of ruin into the operational center of the largest cooperative cattle partnership in that section of Montana happened in the same way everything real happens. One decision, one season, one repaired fence post at a time, until one day you look up and what surrounds you is the accumulated evidence of all those small choices, and you understand in your bones rather than your head that this is what you built and it will stand after you. Maris understood this one evening in the autumn of the 7th year, standing in the kitchen of the house that had felt foreign and cold the first night she arrived, and now felt like the specific shape of her life. The shelves where she kept the files, the table where she'd spread hundreds of maps and ledgers and letters, the window that showed the north pasture in the fading light. Gideon came in from the evening check and hung his hat on the hook by the door, which was the hook that had been empty the night she arrived because he'd only had the one hook and hadn't thought to add another. He'd added one the second week. She hadn't asked him to. "Devereaux's breeding numbers are in," she said. "He had his best calf crop yet." "Rachel will be impossible," Gideon said. She already sent a note. She said, and I'm quoting directly, that any operation that could be improved by public criticism was obviously capable of improvement. Gideon looked at her. "That's the most Rachel Frayne thing anyone has ever said," he said. "I thought so too." He poured himself water from the pitcher on the counter and stood there drinking it, and Maris set down the papers she'd been reading, and for a moment they were simply two people in a kitchen at the end of a day, which was an ordinary thing that had taken years and considerable difficulty to arrive at. "The Helena buyer wants to discuss extending the forward contract another 2 years, she said. "I know, I got the same letter." "It would be the largest forward commitment we've made." "It would." She looked at him. "Are you worried?" He thought about it. "No," he said, which surprised him a little. The absence of that particular worry after so many years of it being constant. "I am, a little," she said. 2 years is a long time." "Then we'll plan for it." "I've already started," she said. He almost laughed. He had learned in 7 years that she was always already started on the thing they were about to discuss, and that this was not a reproach to him, but simply how she worked. The endless forward motion of a mind that saw problems before they arrived and preferred to meet them prepared. It had taken him a while not to find it unsettling. Now it was one of the things he counted on, the way he counted on North being North. She picked up the papers again. He sat down at the table across from her. They worked, as they usually did, in the particular comfortable quiet of two people who had stopped needing to fill silences and had started simply inhabiting them together. Outside, the Crescent K settled into the autumn evening, the recovered pastures and the extended parcels. The barn where Dutch had once stood with his hat in his hands, recalibrating everything he'd assumed. The south fence line where the wire had been cut before she arrived by men who were counting on her to fail. The herd was in the north section now, 460 head moving through the rotation she'd designed 7 years ago on a piece of paper at this same table, the grass coming up strong under them, the way it came up every year now, reliable and earned. There are people in this world who come into a situation and see only what it is. And there are people who come in and see what it could become if someone was willing to do the work of getting it there, not because the work is easy or the outcome is guaranteed, but because the alternative is letting something worth saving fall to people who never deserved it. Maris Cross was the second kind of person. She had known this about herself before she ever stepped off that afternoon stage in Garrison, had known it in the particular lonely way you know things about yourself before the world has given you room to prove them. She had been called a burden. She had been arranged like a piece on a board by men who thought they understood the game better than she did. She had taken the arrangement and made something they couldn't have imagined, and she had done it without becoming someone she wasn't, without shedding the parts of herself they'd mocked, without needing anyone's permission or verdict or forgiveness. Not because she was without doubt. She had doubted herself through every winter, every crisis, every meeting where she could feel the room measuring her against its expectations. Not because she was without fear. She had been afraid on the night rider's attack at the creek crossing in a way that lived in her body for months afterward. Not because it had been fair or easy or without cost, but she had done it anyway, one morning at a time, one number at a time, one decision made carefully in a kitchen at the end of a hard day, and the result was outside the window right now, in the last autumn light, real and solid and hers. The lamp on the table burned steady. Gideon turned a page. Maris wrote a figure in the margin of a contract, and the scratch of the pencil was the only sound in the room, and it was enough.